that I found a delight to know. Until recently, I didn't know Benny Grant, the goaltender of the 1927 Grays, except by reputation. But it's been a real pleasure to go to his home and talk with him about the incidents that happened in his career as a great athlete with the Toronto Maple Leafs and other clubs, and about sport in general. And Benny's been a citizen of Owen Sound since he was a boy. I guess, Benny, your father was an Owen Sounder. I knew your uncle Tom and your cousins Jack and Jean and so on, and so you're a real Owen Sounder.
Yeah, father was born here.
And your father was the custodian of the Boyd Street rink. Some of the real old timers will remember Sandy Grant.
That's for sure. It was great for me. I got in to see all the hockey games, the skate for nothing. So
yes,
I got a good start.
Now, in that 1927 club, but I think it'd be interesting to talk about that club for a moment, and then we'll go back to your early days and school days. But in that, you were the goaltender, and your sub-goaltender was Hedley Smith, who had been the goaltender of the 27 or the 24 Memorial Cup champions.
That's right.
But as you said, Hedley was very young in 1916, and many people retained their interest, their avid interest in hockey, but Hedley wasn't like that. He was bookish, wasn't he? He was seemed to be...
Yes, I think he felt that when he quit, hockey was interfering with his education. Yes. He was going through to be a chartered accountant, and he gave it up.
So, yes. But anyway, you had Hillis Padden from Port Elgin and Buck Moore in defense. Buck was an Owen Sounder. They were in front of you, and Les Beatty was a sub-defense man.
Right.
And Shrimp McDougall was the center man, and a cracking good one. Not very big, but he was good. He had quality.
He sure did.
And he came from where, Benny?
Peterborough.
Peterborough. And then in one wing was Marty Lauder from Durham.
Right.
And the other wing, another well-known Owen Sounder that was a friend of yours and a playmate for many, many years, Jack Markle.
Yeah, he was a real dandy.
Jack was a peach, that's right. A swell fellow and a great hockey player.
He sure was.
Now, we should go back to your very early days. Were you always a goaltender, Benny, in school hockey?
I always played goal.
Always played goal.
Yeah. And as I said, the reason probably was it wasn't very big, and the little fella got shoved in the goal, and the big fellas played with delight. So that's how I started.
Yes. Now, we mentioned your father. You had, there were more in your family, of course. Tell us about who else was there in your family?
Well, I just had one brother.
You had one brother?
Older.
And did you have any sisters?
No.
No sisters,
just one brother.
One older brother.
Yeah.
So,
and he wasn't very much for athletics.
Wasn't interested in sport?
No.
Well,
yet he's turned out to be a top 5-pin bowler in the seniors league.
I see.
But he never played hockey.
Never played hockey?
No.
Well. Well, now, when you played, you no doubt played in public school, for Dufferin School.
Right.
And then for the OSCVI teams.
Right.
And you showed me a picture of some of those OSCVI players. Do you recall any of their names now?
Oh, yeah, there was Stephen Duff Leggett.
Oh, goodness, yes.
And Abra Olson. And Jack Grant played on that team.
And Jack, your cousin Jack Grant.
Yeah, and Ivan Moon. I can't remember too many more.
Well, that's pretty good. Those are in the high school days. Well, then, when did you start to play for the Grays?
I started to play for the Grays in 1925 as a backup for Hedley Smith.
In 25?
And again in 26. But I didn't play in any games.
I see. But in 27, you became the goaltender.
Right.
Although you're only 18, you're still well under junior age.
Oh, yes.
And Hedley would be about the same age, I would suppose.
I think he was about a year older than I was, but he still had another year left.
Yeah. And how many games did you play in 1927? You didn't play in a league in those days. There were exhibition games. And
yeah, all exhibition games, but we didn't have a league. But when we started into the playdowns, we played Meaford to win this division up here.
I see.
And we then went on to play Kitchener they were winners of their division, and that put us into the OHA finals against Newmarket.
I see. Well, now Newmarket Redmond, that was a real hot club too in the Kitchener.
Oh yeah, coached by Bill Hancock.
Bill Hancock, and of course he had a history with Owen Sound too. He was the coach of. That brings up a thing that I wondered about. In pictures of the 1924 Grays, Bill Hancock wasn't recognized as the coach, although he was in fact the coach. But apparently it was frowned upon to bring a coach in. The coach was supposed to be as amateur as the players, and of course that was something else, because the better clubs invariably brought in a few star players to fill the soft spots in the lineup. For instance, Shrimp McDougall and Cooney Whelan in 24, who was one of the really great players.
Yes,
too.
he was.
No question of that.
Yeah.
And of course, now Shrimp McDougall was too small, wasn't he, for pro ranks?
Yes, he did play a bit in pro for Teddy Oak and West Toronto team at one time, but he didn't last. He wasn't big enough.
No. But Jack Markle played many years and but Jack wasn't so big and he wasn't all that fast, but he was smart apparently. He was quite a goal scorer.
Oh yes, he led that league down there. Jack had put him in the net. No, he wasn't too big, but he was a determined hockey player, and he played real well. He should have been in the big league. It was not that he didn't have the ability. It was he just never got the right chance.
Never got a real timing is so important. If you, for instance, if he was the right winger, wasn't he?
Right.
Yes. And if you went up with a club that was strong in right wing, well, then you were severely handicapped. Of course, that was typical of your career too, Benny. You had outstanding goaltenders to try and replace, and there was only 8 clubs at the most.
There was only 6 clubs at that time.
Craig Johnson, a call on
There were only 6 to start off with.
That's right.
I see.
And they didn't carry any spare goaltenders.
Well, what would happen if a goaltender was hurt? There must have been
well,
some
they
provision.
put in anybody they could, even a forward.
Good gracious.
Oh, you remember Lester Patrick went in the playoffs.
In the playoffs, that's right, and he did all right too.
Yeah.
Well, the club must have really tightened up in the checking to if they had to put in an inexperienced goaltender.
Well, they would. They'd give you, even like if I got shoved into a game, they seemed to give you a little more protection than they would with a regular goaltender.
Now, one of the interesting things we should do, before we get into your professional career, we should talk a bit about the coach of the 1927 clubs, Father Jack Spratt. Now, this was really something, and I'm very curious to know how the players reacted to a priest as coach. Now, having a clergyman in your dressing room all the time, did that kind of hold the boys down a bit?
Well, when we first heard that we were going to get a priest for a coach, I'm telling you, we weren't very enthusiastic. But he wasn't there very long until he convinced us that we were all wrong. He was a fine, fine man. And he was also a very knowledgeable hockey man. He knew the game, and he also knew how to handle players. And without him, I don't think we'd have ever won the Memorial Cup.
Wow. Now, he wasn't here for very long, although he came back about 10 years later and was here for a couple of years. But in that time, and you just had one member of his church on your team, in Jack Markle, but this didn't make any difference.
No difference whatsoever.
Now, did he? Was there a noticeable difference? Because, mind you, we must admit, sometimes the language is rough and so on. This and like this, insofar as the fans and sometimes the players are concerned under stress. Did he tend to tone down the remarks?
No, he never really did. He treated us as men.
I see.
And we liked that. I mean, we were boys, but he didn't treat us that way. We were hockey players, and that's it.
Well, now, as regards your training, those in the small centers were severely handicapped because there wasn't artificial ice except in the larger centers. When would you start to train as a team?
Well, we would start about, maybe the end of October. What we did, we'd go to the Y, and then we would put on our running outfits, and we'd run around the city blocks and come back and have a swim. And we'd do that until we would get ice. So which would likely be December by that time.
Yeah, so you'd start sometime in November, perhaps, to get in shape.
Yeah, the end of October, the 1st November.
And what about Father Spratt? He was a relatively young man then, wasn't he?
Well, he wasn't there when we first started.
Oh, he wasn't?
He came when we first got the club together. Alec Bennett was the manager, but we didn't have a coach. He came along after we got on ice.
I see.
And took over. He didn't have anything to do with the pre-training.
Conditioning, the early conditioning.
No.
Well, now, as a player, he apparently had enjoyed quite a successful career as a junior hockey player. I understand he could skate, and you've told me about how he would get out with you at the practices.
Oh, he could sure skate. He could outskate anybody in that club. He'd get them going around the rink, and he'd be behind with a stick, and you were going as fast as you could go, or he'd be whacking you.
Dear. And did you do, I think they later called them wind sprints, stops and starts. Did you do that in your conditioning?
No.
Not at that time?
No, not at that time.
That's a son of a gun. It really is hard on a fellow, but
Yeah.
it's great for conditioning.
No, we never did that.
That's something came along later.
We would practice from 7 to 8 and then walk up to Boyd Street rink and skate till it closed, and that was it.
Wow. And now, as regards Father Spratt, he went to Toronto. Did he go to Toronto from Owen Sound? Because you saw him again.
He went, I think, to Assumption College in Windsor, because when I was playing for Syracuse and Windsor was in the league, he used to come to see me.
I see.
Then after I was back in Toronto a few years later, he was back at St. Michael's.
I see. When you were with the Leafs then,
And I was with the Leafs then.
you saw him
I
frequently.
used to see him quite often then.
Well, he had a magnetic personality. Everyone who knew Father Spratt was enthused about. He made you feel completely at home, despite the fact he was a priest. You felt completely at home with him. As you said, he knew how to handle people.
Oh, he sure did.
He had a magnetic personality. Well, that was splendid. Now, you mentioned Alec Bennett was the coach of the club, and Earl Pratt was connected with the club.
Right.
And the trainer was
Major Wetton.
Major Wetton. Wasn't he from? Was he from Wyerton?
Oh, he went to Wyerton
He went to
years
Wyerton
later as a
later.
lighthouse keeper, but he was from Owen Sound.
I see. He was from Owen Sound. Now, the Major was a nickname, I take.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And what about, of course, Shrimp McDougall that was a natural nickname because he was so short. But he did play some professional hockey.
Yes, he did, and he ended up playing out in Calumet. They call it the Iron League.
Oh,
It
I
was
see.
a
Calumet, Michigan.
Yes, it was a kind of a semi-pro, and he played out there for a couple of years.
Well, now, something I've often wondered about, who coached the goaltenders? There were...
I don't remember anybody ever coaching me. You had to kind of learn from what you could see and what you did on your own, because most coaches weren't goaltenders, and
No, that's right.
and they didn't know how
They just
to
didn't.
really tell you what to do other than to stand up, maybe.
Well, and of course, that was the important thing at that time. A goaltender was supposed to be on his feet. And if you had to sprawl to make a stop, you got to your feet just as quickly as possible, providing you weren't smothering the puck, of course.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, now, two goaltenders came along, and probably towards the end of your career, that changed the style of goaltending. One was Charlie Gardner, and he was a great one.
Yeah, well, he played in my era.
In your era,
He
yes.
was the first goaltender that I ever saw that played outside the crease,
To cut down the angle.
cut down the angles.
Other than that, the goaltenders hugged the post and kept feeling either with their stick or their
On
hand.
their hand, if they couldn't feel the post, then they were out of position.
That's right. That's right. And later on, of course, this was, I guess it was in the, probably during the war sometime, about that time that Jacques Plante came along and started to wear a mask. Now that changed the whole business.
He came after the war because I played in '44 for the Leafs, and Bill Dernan was playing goal for the
that's
Canadians
right.
at that time.
Now, Bill Dernan was rated a great goaltender, but he wasn't rated a great goaltender as a senior goaltender.
Oh, no, Toronto had him and let him go.
That's right. But with the Canadians, they had a powerhouse there, and he come into his own then, apparently.
He got there at the right time. He was ambidextrous. He used to catch with either hand.
Is that a fact? I didn't know that.
He would take the stick depending on what side you were coming in, and he'd change.
And he changed.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that was a help.
It was an
then.
advantage.
Well, now with the Leafs, you were up with the Leafs, and you alternated with Chabot, and then in later years with Hainsworth.
Right.
And this was you had some really good games. You had a lot of shutouts. And
Well, one
in your
season, Lawrence Chabot and I started off alternating, and we started the season with 5 straight shutouts.
5 shutouts right off the bat. Well. Well, now.
Don't ask me to tell you the rest of the story.
I presume there had to be a game when everything went wrong, and there had to be a goat then.
Well, it came on Christmas night in Detroit, and it was Lawrence game to play, but being that he was married and I was single, they let him stay home and I went down. Well, we didn't play very well. We got beat 10-1.
There's probably a good reason for it, too.
Well, as Conn Smythe said, what were the other 16 guys doing, Benny? He said they weren't putting it in the net and they weren't keeping it out of ours. But I was in Boston the next day.
Well. So, well, of course, I suppose too it's a question of salary to some degree. They didn't want to carry two major league goaltenders and pay those salaries.
No.
The salary would be less, presumably.
No, they would fire me out every year to someplace, and they'd pay my salary or part of it.
Oh, I see. Yes, and the other club would pick up part of it naturally. Yeah. Of course, there just wasn't the loose money there is nowadays. Does it make you feel like shaking your head and groaning when you see how much athletes get today? And what they put into it for what they get out of it?
No, it really doesn't.
Doesn't bother you?
I felt that during the Depression years when I played in the 1930s, we were making pretty good money, and engineers and people well educated were starving to death. So we were getting pretty good money.
Well, and that's a nice way to look at it, because most people, a good many people anyway, let us say, would be envious and jealous and say, just look what those fellows get today. And the equipment they have, everything's top notch, and they're sitting. And what's more, to save income tax, they often have clever lawyers arrange their contracts spread over a good many years. They're sitting pretty for life.
Oh yeah, guaranteed.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now there's another goaltender that I think it would be nice to refer to, because you could probably sympathize with him. Glenn Hall was one of the great goaltenders, and I've often heard it said how nervous he would be before a game. Sometimes he would be sick at his stomach. Was this general? Did many athletes tighten up and be physically ill before a game because of nerves?
Yes, and I was one of them. But
you could sympathize with him.
I could sympathize with him, and Billy Taylor used to get sick on the bench and make everybody else sick.
Right on the bench.
Yeah.
Just at the start of a game.
Yeah.
Once you got
going, you're all right.
Yes, forget about it all. Yeah. And of course, sometimes those fellows are so keyed up that they give a superlative performance as a result. They're just right on the bit, ready to go.
Oh yeah, they think that's the way you should be.
Well, I suppose so, to be a great athlete. Although there are some good players that were so relaxed about it all, and still they managed to perform well. What about Charlie Conacher and Bush and Jackson and those fellows?
You couldn't tell by either one of them that they were upset or nervous at all, not by looking at them anyway.
Well,
Busher was the flamboyant one, and Charlie said nothing as a rule.
And Joe Primo centered them.
Yeah.
And Primo had been around for a number of years and come into his own as a center man for Conacher and Jackson.
That's right.
That was a great line. There were some wonderful lines at that time. Boston had, who'd Boston have? Oh, you would know.
They had the dynamite line, Clapper, Wild, and Gaynor. And Detroit had Lewis and Ebby Goodfellow.
Yes. And
Rangers had the Cook brothers and Boucher.
Oh, yes. And the Canadians had Howie Morenz,
Joliet and Gagne
on the other wings. Now, Joliet was well known for wearing a little black peak cap.
Right.
But he clever hockey player, apparently.
Very good hockey player.
Yes.
Excellent.
Now, they had another center man who was a marvelous checker, that Canadian club. Was that Lepine?
Pete Lepine.
Pete Lepine, yes. What was his fort? Was it poke check or sweep check?
He was a hook checker.
A hook checker. Well,
but he was a tall,
he had the reach.
Big man. He had a big reach.
Well, that's quite a help, of course. Well, now when Chabot, I saw a game one time, and that is the first game after Hainsworth and Chabot were traded, and Charlie Conacher shot one from just inside the blue line, and Chabot grabbed it and threw it down and knocked it out to one of the defensemen. Then he took off his glove and he rubbed his hands against his hockey pants. Now this wasn't put on. When Charlie Conacher blazed one in, it was really going, wasn't it?
Oh, he could really shoot them. It was just a wrist shot too, and it was a heavy puck. It almost knocked you down.
Is that a fact?
But he could really rifle them.
And Lionel, of course, was a marvelous all-around athlete.
I
His
told
brother
you
Lionel.
the story of Lionel. He always cut the palms out of his gloves. And Charlie rifled one, he caught it, and Charlie skated by and said, "Shake it, Lionel, it'll fall off."
And I guess it just about would, too. He'd probably just about paralyze a fellow.
Oh, he would, yeah.
Yeah. Were there other players who could shoot nearly as hard as...
Oh, yes,
Charlie Connor?
yeah. Dick Clapper had a good shot.
Now, he's a big, strong man,
Morenz,
too,
of course, could rifle them.
Yes.
And there were some defensemen like Earl Siebert, and Babe Siebert could shoot pretty good, too.
Babe Siebert was another like Dick Clapper. Started out as a wingman and wound
Ended
up
up
as an
as a
outstanding
defenseman, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, now, about Morenz, it wouldn't be, it'd be incomplete if we didn't talk about Howie Morenz. How do you feel about Morenz? Where did he stand as a
He's
as
the
a
best
forward?
hockey player that I've ever played against, that I would think that in this day and age he'd have been even greater than he was then, because the game is so much more open than it was then.
And what about the rinks at that time? Were they pretty much standard size as they are today? Or
Yes, they were.
They
Yeah,
were.
pretty well. The ice space were about the same.
Now, Morenz fort was his speed, but he could shoot, and he could stick handle, presumably.
Oh yes, he did everything well. Everything. Yeah.
Was Morenz considered to be a team player, or was he like he was the Canadian club was built around him?
That's
I
right.
think you might say.
Well, I would think he'd be a team
He'd be a
player.
team player,
I
too.
never was on a team where he played, but he certainly.
Wasn't any evidence of any
Not that
resentment because of all the publicity he got.
No, I
and so
don't
on.
think so.
Well, now, as regards other hockey players of that time, who besides Morenz, who did you fear or respect as forwards in the NHL?
Well, Bill Cook was one, for sure.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there was Ebby Goodfellow in Detroit, and Clapper, and Wild, and Boston. And then you had Maroons with Siebert and Smith and Nell Stewart.
Oh, Nell Stewart was one of the
Nellie could really put the puck on the net.
Yes. He was a big, strong man. I've heard it said you could never lift his stick to take the puck.
No, we used a 10 lie straight up and down, and he got it in there, and you couldn't get it away from him.
As regards international hockey, do you like to see the European teams play? Do you like that style of hockey, Ben?
I like that style of hockey. I think they play it very well. I don't know if our clubs are able to produce the best teams. They do. Everybody's aimed at that one club, where here we can't do that because of the National League.
Well, that's right, and this is the livelihood of our players depends on the success of their clubs. So
That's
their
right.
first allegiance is to the club.
Right.
And it's not easy to meld a club in just a few weeks, even a month's time. It takes a while playing together, considerable, to get the best out of players.
Oh,
to
yes.
work as a unit.
Definitely.
But it's nice hockey to watch, this international hockey.
Oh, yes.
The Russians have certainly revolutionized play. They're in marvelous conditions. Those fellows seem to be able to skate as fast at the end of the game as at the start.
Yes, that's for sure.
What about players in your day? Would most of them fit into the style of hockey played in the NHL today?
Oh, I think, yes, I think definitely they
They
would.
certainly had the skill.
Oh, yes, I think they would. I don't think there's any doubt they wouldn't.
Do you care for the slam bang shoot the puck into the corner style that we see on television today, or do you hearken back to the days when it was your days? It was more of a science, and a player had to be a skater and a stick handler, or he just didn't get on the ice. That's all. A big bruiser had to have ability.
Oh, yes.
Nowadays, there seems to be, if you're a scrapper, there seems to be a place for you in some clubs.
Yes, that's right.
Some clubs are looking for a policeman.
Yeah, that's right.
Now, we must mention that Imperial Oil was your employer for a number of years, and you worked for for them after you were retired from hockey?
I worked for them before, and then in 1943 and 44, I went back and played for the Leafs, but I was employed by the Imperial Oil at that time.
Who were the managers for Imperial? Was it Charlie Robinson? Was he one of the?
Yeah, Charlie Robinson was the Ontario manager when I went back.
He'd been manager in Owen Sound at one time.
That's right.
I think, yes, and then was an Ontario manager. Now, Benny, besides hockey, you've achieved considerable prominence in golf. Did you take that up while you were playing hockey?
Well, I started a caddy on this course when I was younger. Well, then
down at the Owen Sound Golf
That's
Links
right. And then
on the west side.
I started to play in Toronto, and when I was in there in the summer, and then when we moved up here in 1940, of course, I started to play here.
You started to play here, and you've been one of Owen Sound's most successful golfers.
Well, I won the club championship a few years ago.
Yeah. Yes. Well. Now you married a Toronto girl, I believe, Benny, while you were.
That's
while you
right.
were playing there. And how many in your family?
We have three boys and a girl.
2 boys and a girl. And have they been interested in sport?
Not really.
Not really. No, they were no doubt interested in your career, but they haven't been active in sport.
No, they both played in the minor league here, you know.
I see, yes.
But
Owen Sound hockey.
that's as far as they got.
Well, for me, it's been a real pleasure, Benny. It's brought back those memories of the 24-27 era, and for a number of years beyond that, there were great Grays teams sponsored by the Crescent Athletic Club. And here we have some of the trophies, the personal trophies that you got as a member of the 1927 Memorial Cup team, Canadian champions. That's the Canadian Championship and the Ontario Championship and the Crescent Athletic Club stick here, and with a crescent on it and then AC. That's pretty nice with a hockey stick from the Crescents. So we'll see that the camera picks that up. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you, Benny. I've been most taken with your modesty and your openness, and when I approached you about this with some trepidation because I hadn't known you before, but you've made me feel most at ease. I've enjoyed it immensely, and I thank you kindly.
I thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Benny Grant.